All right, so we're going to talk a little bit today about how to add paid features to your serverless apps. Before we get going, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this session is not about. This session is not about how to collect money. Obviously, that's something you need to be aware of, and there's a lot of things out there: Stripe, PayPal, Square, QuickBooks, right? Invoicing, whatever. But that stuff, while it's important and does need to be done, not particularly exciting, interesting topic. And to be perfectly frank with you, the last time I really had to deal with this was before Stripe was even a thing, or at least not a well-known thing. So I'm not the best guy to have that conversation. But here's what we are going to talk about. First, we'll talk a little bit about why you should consider tiers in a SaaS application, what things make it worth doing. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to manage which customers have access to which tiers or features. We'll talk how you can add to your code, what things you should think about when you're putting stuff in your code that talks about the different tiers and features that your customers have. We'll get a little bit, talk a little bit about the noisy neighbor problem. This is kind of a general SaaS problem that you need to be aware of when you're building a SaaS application in general, but there's some implications that particular to tiers. So we'll talk a little bit about what things to think about and things you can do to kind of alleviate some of that problem. And then lastly, we'll talk about how to make sure you're not losing money, and kind of tied with that, of course, is, what things to think about as you're deciding what things to pay to charge for and what things to make free or at different tiers within your application. Introduction to myself. My name is Jason Wadsworth. I'm the chief architect at Armanino, which is a top 20 accounting firm. I am a fourth year, soon hopefully to be a fifth year AWS community builder. I have over 20 years building software with about 13 years in AWS. And every time I think back to the early days of AWS, it's just amazing to think about how much has been done in the last 13 years. If any of you guys have been around anywhere close to that long, it's just night and day. It's so different. It's crazy. I'm a startup junkie. I've worked at like 6 or 7 startups, depending on how you count them. So I really love kind of the startup atmosphere and the way things are thought of and kind of that culture. You'll see that as we talk through some of these slides. Some of that will come out as I talk through different pieces of things. I'm a SaaS enthusiast. You'll quite often hear me talking about things SaaS related. Obviously, this topic is a SaaS related conversation. I've done some presentations at different conventions on that. And of course, I'm a serverless lover. That's why we're all here, because we love serverless. And I am definitely a big fan of serverless. I take very much a serverless first approach to things. So generally speaking, it's proved to me that you can't do it in serverless before we start taking that away. And so most of what we do in our organization is serverless, and we'll keep going that way until we find a place where it just doesn't work well. So that's kind of my approach to things. All right, so let's get started. First, what's the point of tiers? Why are we even talking about this conversation at all? The first thing I'll say is it allows you to increase adoption by adding value to your application to users at little to no cost to them, right? So this is kind of thinking of it like, let's say I have an application today that I'm charging money for, and I can add a tier that's maybe a lower cost tier or a free tier, and that allows me to increase adoption. And of course, increased adoption means more users, and there's a lot of benefits to that. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But at the end of the day, increasing adoption is a big value point in adding tiers. Now, along with that, and kind of the reason why you want to do that is it creates an opportunity to upsell. And this goes both ways, right? If you have a current offering that you are charging money for and you add a free tier, doing so allows you to have a whole bunch more users that you can kind of now have them on your platform and create opportunities for them to start paying you. But the flip side of that is I have a free application and I want to start making money. You can start adding tiers to that application to start giving people an opportunity to say, you know what, this thing that I have today that's free is great, but I want to start charging for some other feature and functionality that allows you to do more with the application than you can do today. One thing that's often overlooked is that having tiers in a larger audience allows you to learn from a larger audience. It's very easy, especially early on in the startup world, where you have a pretty small group of customers and you'll get feedback, and it's really hard to understand, like, how important is this feedback, right? When you have a sample pool of 10, 20 people, 1 or 2 users can really make it feel like this is important. But when you have a sample pool of 100, 1,000, now that you can kind of weed out some of the noise a lot easier. It's important to keep in mind when you do have a larger audience and you do have multiple tiers, that sometimes you'll hear feedback from people that are very different from each other, right? So somebody in a free tier may not be the same kind of customer as somebody who is paying you. So you do need to keep that in mind. But ultimately, at the end of the day, having more people using your application is really great for feedback. So keep that in mind, even if you're thinking like, do I want to get rid of my free tier? And, there's costs associated with it. Is it worth having? Just the ability to learn from a larger audience is, generally speaking, worth keeping around. You might want to make sure you're not doing things that are overly cost prohibitive, but generally speaking, have a lot of larger audiences is worth doing. Next, it can enable you to do things that you couldn't do for free. So imagine you've got some application out there that's free. And, a good example in today's world is adding a large language model, some kind of AI thing to your application that, enables some feature that you don't have today. You want to be able to do that for your end users, but it costs too much to just give it away, or it costs too much for the level of price that they're charging for the application today. You don't necessarily want to increase your costs in general, but you do want to give people that option. Sometimes just adding another tier is the way you can enable doing something that you just simply couldn't do today for free or for the price point that you've got. So free tiers enable that capability as well. All right, so how do we manage our tiers? We're going to talk kind of two general categories here. One, first, things not to do. Don't build your own tools. As an engineer, I'm sure a lot of you guys can probably relate to this. Like, everything is something that we can solve. Right? It's a problem that I can go fix that. I can do that. And quite often we look at it like, this thing that I'm going to use, this tool that's available, it costs this amount of money and I could do it for some, I don't need all these capabilities and I could do it for less. That seems like a good idea. You're saving money, right? You can do something smaller. But the problem is engineering resources are so limited and so important that you don't want to spend your time building tools that don't differentiate you, right? And you hear this all the time when AWS talks about undifferentiated lifting and things. At the end of the day, you want to focus your engineering efforts on things that make your customers' experience better. A tier management tool doesn't really do that unless you are building a tier management tool for your customers, right? So within your application, focus on things that add value to your application. Don't build tools yourselves. The next thing is just don't make it more complicated than it needs to be, right? And its simplest form is just, do I not have this tier? Do I or do I not have this feature? Doesn't need to be more complex than that. At least when you start off, keep it simple. There may be a point in time as you learn things about your application, about your users, about how things are being done, that you might start to figure out that there are opportunities to add some complexity that actually simplify things, but never start there. Always start with the simple things, because that'll just make your life easier going forward. So what things to do? Obviously, if I'm telling you not to use your own tool, build your own tools, then you need to use third-party tools. I like to use feature flags for this sort of thing. We use LaunchDarkly where I'm at today, but there are other ones available. Split.io is a good example. AWS has some feature flag capabilities. Really what you're looking for is something that you can pass in at its simplest form, the tenant identifier, your customer's identifier, and say, do I have this? Yes or no? Something that simple. I would start with options that don't scale. And this is, again, a big startup thing, right? Where when you're building things in a new application, for example, you want to start doing things, again, as an engineer, you want to like automate everything, right? But you need to start thinking about things in terms of like, this is going to be a little bit painful at first, and that's okay, right? So managing who has what features, it can be an email that gets sent that somebody has to go manually adjust in a UI. That's okay. Who gets billed when and how much they're owed, that can be managed in a spreadsheet, and that's okay, right? That doesn't work when you have hundreds, thousands of customers, but it does work early on. And what it allows you to do is, again, focus on building the things in your application that add value and learn things before you commit to them. Because if you start building a bunch of automations and stuff in place early, you may have spent time building things that don't end up being used. You might end up throwing them away, deciding that they weren't worth doing. So you want to kind of step back and say, you know what, we'll start with things that don't scale. Once we figure it out, then the next thing, build it as we grow. A good example of that is, the feature flag management, right? If we're going to collect money via Stripe, initially we might just say we collect the money, send an email, somebody goes in and changes the values and it gets updated manually. But you could say, you know what, we're going to automate that now. When Stripe happens, we're going to put some code in there that goes in and sets the flags automatically via an API call. And that's when you start doing it. You might build, maybe you have a UI that you want to build around turning the tiers on and off for your customers, something simple that, again, is calling into that third-party API, to actually store and manage the features, but maybe you put a little front end in front of it, right? Build those things as you grow, as you figure out where your pain points are and when you need them. All right, so the important part of this, how do we make it work? First thing I'll say is focus on features, not tiers. We're talking about tiers throughout this, and obviously this seems a little bit like a derailment or off topic, maybe, I don't know. But how many guys have seen something that looks like this on a website where like, hey, the free tier includes these features, and then the basic tier includes everything free plus these couple features. If you go in your application all over the place and you say, if the tier is basic, they get this. If the tier is basic, they get this. The tier is free, they get this and this. Then everywhere in your application, if you decide to move something from basic over to free, now you got to go find those places in your application and change it. Now, in this case, that's probably pretty simple, right? It's one feature. You find the one place in your code that I got to add I have feature 5 and I need to go add the free tier to it. Doesn't sound too bad, right? That's not too bad. But now I say, you know what? We want to add a whole new tier, and that's going to have some new things in it. Maybe it's going to take on some other ones. Now I got to go through everywhere in my application and change every spot that this is referencing the tiers, and I got to add the premium tier to it. That's painful. That makes it really difficult to be flexible as you're building your application to be able to change things as you go. So if you focus on features instead, then your application code just says, do they have this feature? Yes or no? It's as simple as that. I don't have to go in everywhere in the code and make changes when I want to change what belongs to those tiers. Something externally, that feature flag management tool, maybe even just a spreadsheet that says, these are the things that belong to these tiers. When I add a new customer to a different tier, I go in and add those features that are associated with them. And again, when you add automation, then you say automatically when I change them from one tier to the next, I go in and I don't just say, put them in the basic tier. I say, okay, make sure they have feature 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 all turned on. And then they automatically get that. The other thing that this enables for you that can be pretty important is the ability to have some flexibility even outside of the tiers themselves. So imagine you have a feature that you have in the basic tier and you decide, you know what, it's kind of pricey. We want to move that to the premium tier, but I have customers that are already paid for on the basic tier. And I want to allow them to keep having it to, whatever they paid for, and then we'll upcharge them later, but they need to be able to keep doing it today. Imagine having to do that in your code base. You're going to have to go through everywhere in your code and say, the basic tier gets this feature, but only if there are these 3 customers. I don't want to have to do that. That's terrible. But if you manage this inside of a separate thing that just says, these are the features that are associated with it, now I can say, yeah, this person's a basic tier person, but they also get this feature. And that enables the kind of a la carte option as well, right? So you can say, you know what, these are our tiers, but we're going to do something special for you. You want the premium feature level 6, but you don't really care about feature 7. We're going to do a special deal for you. And I can just enable that, right? That enables sales to do things that don't require engineering effort. And that's a big plus, right? So something to keep in mind. Focus on features, not tiers. Next, don't confuse permissions and features. This is something that's pretty common to do because if you think about it, API access, for example, there's a lot of overlap here, right? If you think, does somebody have permission to access this API? That's a permission thing, right? But if the feature isn't turned on, that's sort of a permission thing as well. You could even imagine an API endpoint returning a 403 forbidden because they don't have that feature. But they do differ. While they have overlap, they differ, right? So permissions, for example, tend to quite often go into object level access. Right? So I can access the feature of viewing files, but I can only view this file and not that file. That's permissions, right? Permissions allow you to go down into object level stuff. Features vary in a different way in that it can affect application flow. So for example, I have something that goes through the application. Let's use the AI model where let's say we have a feature that's like some search capability, and whether or not they have the AI feature turned on, they just get basic search versus an AI-based search, right? That's an application flow. It doesn't have a permission that's on or off. It's just when we get into this piece of the application, because of a feature, I have a different flow within my application. So they do have overlap, but make sure you don't confuse the two and don't just trust your permissions to be your features because they do differ. All right, I kind of hit this a little bit, use feature flags. This is kind of a little code snippet, but what we really want to do is, again, like use something that can tell you based on some information, do they or do they not have this feature turned on? And so this little code snippet, ignore the red here. I just kind of tried to do something to reduce the amount of code in here. But what we have here, this is an AppSync resolver, and we're using the Launch Darkly client. AppSync, we're using a Lambda authorizer. So with our Lambda authorizer, we add some information to the resolver context that gets passed into those Lambda functions. And in particular, what we're adding here is a tenant identifier and a user identifier. And that information we can pull out of the resolver context. And then when we call into the Launch Darkly client, we basically just say, hey, given this feature, we pass in, the key is just kind of something that Launch Darkly uses to uniquely identify a record in their system. But you can add any number of context items. And this is pretty typical of any API, of any feature flag API. The one that we're, of course, using is a tenant ID, because that's all we care about. If you're in a UI, you might be sending things like their email address, their first and last name, and you'll want to, you can maybe do all kinds of things with those features. But for this case, we want to keep it simple. We just want to say, given this tenant ID, does this person have this feature? And that's just going to return a value. And if it's false, then we're just going to say, sorry, you can't have that feature. And otherwise, we're going to do the rest of our code. There's, again, not a lot of complexity to this, right? It's a simple check that I can do up front early in the process and run my code just like I would before. All right, next thing, make sure the UI is aware. This is one that kind of seems obvious, right? So you've got this bit of content and you got some feature, and of course you don't want to make that button available to them if they can't do the thing, right? So at a minimum, you want to gray it out, kind of indicate, yeah, you can't do this. Quite often we'll you'll see UIs that we hide things that the users can't do. And that's kind of generally a good idea, right? It creates a better user experience to not show customers or end users things that they can't do. But if you have a SaaS application you're wanting to upsell, don't always do that. Use your application as a way to upsell, right? So when they hover over that feature button, it tells them, hey, this is available at the premium tier, because that allows them to sell within their application, right? These are users who are already using your system as it is today. And if you can tell them, hey, there's some extra capability that you're not taking advantage of, yeah, it costs money, but it's there. They may not even realize it, right? Your users may be using your system and not realize you added some new capability to your application, because they're just off happy. They're happy with what they've got. But man, if they would have realized that you added this AI capability, man, that made a huge difference to them. They would have been willing to pay for it. So use your application, your UI, as a selling point for your application. Make sure it's aware of what features are available at what tiers. All right, let's talk a little bit about dealing with noisy neighbors. So I mentioned this is a general SaaS problem. When you're dealing with SaaS applications, of course, the main thing you're trying to achieve is, getting some advantages of sharing infrastructure, sharing resources. And the consequence of that is that one tenant in your application can be influenced by another, right? So whether it's compute resources that are shared, whether it's queues that can get throttled, these are all things where one customer can impact another. And the reason this becomes really important with tiers is you have maybe paid customers or different level paid customers, free customers. You really don't want your paid customers to have a negative experience because you added a free tier, right? So all of a sudden, you got happy customers and you're like, let's add a free tier and see if we can get more people. And a whole bunch of people come on board, and now your paid customers are seeing a degraded experience. That's not good. You want to make sure that doesn't happen. You obviously don't want your free tier people to have a bad experience either, but you especially don't want to, piss off the people that are paying the bills, right? So it's really important to make sure that you're kind of protecting that. And so there's some things you can do to do that. The first thing you can do is do some rate limiting. You'll see this all over the place, of course, in AWS, right? Where AWS has got, concurrency limits on Lambda and API calls that can only be called so many times per second or per minute or whatever it may be. It's a really easy way to just say, you know what, before things even happen in the application, I'm going to make sure that the amount of data that one customer is doing doesn't impact the other. And so API Gateway is a good example of how you can get this in your application. API Gateway has usage plans, and those usage plans allow you to put rate limiting in place, say that anyone using this usage plan can only get so many requests per minute. And the cool thing about usage plans in particular is that you can have multiples of them and say, for example, one per tier. So your free tier maybe has a lower rate limit than your paid tier, and maybe your premium tier has a really even higher rate limit. And so every one of your end users or your tenants would have their own API key, and they would be limited for how much they can hit your API based on those usage plans. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of things in AWS that have this capability. You can do some limited stuff, I think, with WAF. If you put that in front of things, this is only available in the REST API and API Gateway. It's not available in HTTP API. It's also sadly not available for AppSync today, which is one I would really wish they would add it to because I use AppSync a lot. So I'm hoping that AWS kind of steps that up, but it is a good way to get some really easy rate limiting out of the box from AWS. And keep in mind, it's just not going to be available everywhere. If you can't do it, you kind of have to roll your own stuff, and that can get a lot more complicated. I think there was a good conversation happening in the Discord about circuit breakers, and they have a lot of common with this, right? So you can do some things in code to kind of give you the same sort of functionality, but obviously they're already into that first Lambda function, right? So you're already kind of sharing some degree of resources no matter what, but you can do some things that at least protect downstream services in code if you need to. All right, the next one, segmented queues. This is one that I kind of really like doing. And what we're doing here is saying, you know what, based on the tier, I'm going to let the data flow through the system at a different speed. And so, you notice the queue on the top, that's going to say that's our free tier. And the data is getting backed up there, whereas on the bottom, it's not. And the way I like to describe this to people is if you imagine you go to a theme park like Disney World and you go to one of the really, cool rides and there's a really long line and you're like, man, that's terrible. But, oh, I have the fast pass. I get to go on this other line, right? They're both going to the same ride, right? In this case, they're both going to the same Lambda function, but because I had the fast pass, I didn't have to go through the queue that everyone else was going through. I went through a much shorter one. The same thing applies here. So in this case, I'm using an event bridge rule that says if the tier is the free tier, I'm going to send them to this queue on the top. Otherwise, I'm going to send them to this bottom queue. The really nice thing is, I think last year they enabled this, maybe the year before, where the integration between SQS and Lambda allows you to limit the concurrency on the integration level, right? So I can say that the top queue can only have 10 requests, 10 Lambda function invocations concurrent on that queue, but the same Lambda function on the bottom one can maybe have 100 of them integrated with it at the same time, right? So again, all hitting the same code base, but a different amount of throughput. And then you even like imagine like a premium tier, like maybe you have a customer that's like really high value and they get a queue all to themselves. They might have a lower throughput, right? Because they're only one customer's data, but it's guaranteed to only be blocked by them, right? And so you can do that as well. So segmented queues are a really powerful way to kind of keep the traffic levels at different amounts going through your system and allowing people at different levels to go at different speeds. All right, tenant partitioning. So this is kind of an interesting one. Again, not going to apply to everyone, but something to kind of think about if you're going to go to a multi-account strategy. The simplest way that people like to think about it is like, put your free people over in this tenant or in this AWS account, and then maybe your other ones in another account. That's not really the approach I like to take. And the reason why is, one, it kind of just creates this like unbalanced system, right? Where what accounts are doing the most work isn't necessarily balanced. But more importantly, as people move from one tier to the other, becomes a challenge for moving data. And so that's something you want to avoid, right? Because moving data around is not easy. And there's costs associated with it. There's complexities, especially if you want to keep things live as you're doing it. That's a whole nother mess of like how I get data from one account to another while the account's still active. So what I like to do is approach this more of a balanced approach. So this is kind of the way I would do it, right? I put the tenants in and they just start moving to the account based on where there's capacity, right? So you can put whatever logic you want to put in your system to identify where that capacity is. But at the end of the day, it's having some way of kind of, instead of just a pure round robin, saying, you know what, account one's got more capacity than account 2 or 3. The next one's going to go there, even though those other accounts have fewer customers over in them. So you can kind of start spreading things around a little bit more dynamically. Of course, this adds complexity to your system as well, right? So it's not something you want to necessarily do unless you need it, but there's a lot of cool things that can be done there. I'm actually working on some stuff to kind of enable this. There's some other benefits you can get out of this as well. So something to definitely keep in mind. The last thing on anything with related to the noisy neighbor problem is do some monitoring. Make sure you understand what's going on, so that if queues are getting backed up, if streams are getting backed up, if lambdas are throttling, know about that before your customers start reporting it to you. Have monitoring in place so that you are aware of what's going on in your system all the time. Whether that's using the tools that AWS provides for you or using third-party tools like Datadog or Lingo or whatever they may be, make sure you have some monitoring in place to know what's happening in your system. All right, last subject, understanding your cost. First and foremost, add custom metrics. Anywhere in your application where you have something that you want to understand how much it's being used, at a minimum, put something in your code that says this feature, this part of my code was executed. It doesn't even need to be anything more complicated than that. At a minimum, just that, right? I would encourage you to do it everywhere and anywhere that you want to potentially, include it as a different tier thing. But at a very minimum, make sure you include anything that you might want to make free. Because if you don't have understanding of where and how that free thing is being used, then it's hard to understand where the costs are coming from and how it's being used. When you do that, the thing you really want to do is make sure you include on those metrics the tenant and tier information, right? So that, and these will be like dimensions, right? So you've got like the information about what you're collecting. They hit this particular function, and here's the tier or tenant that was doing it. This allows you to start being able to look at your metrics a little bit more down at the particular tier level or tenant level. So I can say this feature is being used a lot by my free tier people, but not by my paid tier, or vice versa, right? And so I can start really analyzing the data across tiers and even down at the tenant level. So I can see this particular tenant is costing me a lot of money, and try to understand whether or not, that's okay, whether or not I need to figure out things that I need to change. Are they abusing the system? Are they just a high-end user? Whatever that is, by adding those metrics to those dimensions to your metrics, you can start looking at things in a different way. When you do this, when possible, gather real use data. So as an example, DynamoDB will return to you the consumed capacity on every request. Now, of course, you can go into the DynamoDB metrics and you can see how much consumed capacity is being used on your table, but you can't tell how much consumed capacity is being used by an individual tenant or by a tier. But if you grab that real use data, so you make a request to DynamoDB, you get that data back, you store, this is how much the request was, how much was used, and this is the tier and the tenant that it was associated with. Now I can start analyzing that data across tiers and across individual tenants. And that's something I can't get out of the raw metrics out of DynamoDB. So all this, what this enables for you to do is now I have a visibility to where my usage patterns are across my tiers. And I can start looking and saying, okay, these features are going to cost me X, approximately this amount per user or per customer. And I can start making real business decisions on how much I want to charge people, or whether or not I want to charge people based on real data rather than just, oh, that sounds like a good thing to give them. So doing this can be a really valuable kind of an input to the entire process of understanding how your data is being used and how you want to charge people. So just a quick recap. As you're building things, tiers allow you to kind of upsell your app, right? So whether it's, adding a free tier to an existing app or adding a paid tier to an app that is currently free, tiers allow you to upsell. Feature flags are a great way to manage tiers, whether or not you're using, something like LaunchDarkly or Split.io or AWS's. The main thing is try not to build something yourself unless you really need to. Probably if you take nothing else away from this from a coding perspective, focus on features and not tiers. I think that's a really big one that adds so much flexibility and will make your life so much easier as the business wants to make changes. Your code doesn't have to have as many changes to it. Don't forget about your neighbors. Always be aware that everything that happens in an application can affect everyone else. And so really important to understand how what you're doing and what changes are being in your application are going to impact everyone else. And then, of course, last, always be aware of cost. Make sure that you understand that when I add this feature to the free tier, that it's going to cost me so much because I have this many free users, and I know that it costs approximately this much per user, so I can kind of estimate how much this is going to cost me. But being aware of it, at a minimum, just being aware of it is really important. That's all I have. Thank you so much. Gladly open to conversations if anybody has something they want to talk about.
Oh my gosh, Jason, that is a fantastic presentation.
Thank
I'm
you.
gonna I'm gonna brag and say I've seen this before, and I still am just kind of blown away by watching it again. I
Appreciate it.
love it. Where just where is all of this knowledge coming from? How do you know all these things?
A lot of it, yeah, a lot of it's just experience, right? Like you start to see things happen over time. Again, like having worked at a lot of different startups, the pool of where I've seen things is pretty dynamic, right? Like I haven't worked in a ton of startups all in the same space. I've worked in startups all over the place. And so some of it's that, some of it's just listening, right? Like, I hear conversations about things and I absorb those conversations because they're interesting. And so when I hear somebody else talk about it, I think about it. I'm like, that makes sense. And I can see how that makes sense. And even if I don't have a direct place to use that today, I may in the future. And so I'll kind of keep that knowledge for when I do. But I mean, with anything, right? Experience is your greatest teacher.
And there's really something to be said about your awareness as well. Like the
Yep.
thing that really that what I want to use as my example here is when you were talking about not hiding things to get people to be upsold on additional
Yep.
features at a higher tier. Like don't hide a button and just have it disabled and say, well, if you were a pro, then you could do this. And it's like I never have thought to do that, but like literally every game I ever play on my phone these days has that.
Right.
And I've just never really been aware that that's like a core SaaS concept.
Yeah. Some of that's, it's interesting because you do see it, right? You see it all over the place. And sometimes you just don't even realize like that's what's being done. And I guess maybe, a little bit of that comes from being in the startup space and needing to be aware of all these things and how they impact you. Like it, I think it becomes really important when you're doing B2B or B2C, I should say, right? Like when you're going direct to consumers, you really have to understand that space. And I've done some of that where I've worked at some startups where we were, business to consumer. I think in the B2B space, it's important still. The end users are ultimately the ones who are pushing this upstream and saying, hey, this feature is worth paying for. But you do a lot more sales outside of the app as well. And so, the sales channel is a little different. The way you sell is different, but I think it's still important to have in there.
Yeah. So you mentioned feature flags, and that really seems to be throughout the course of the presentation. That really seems to be like the linchpin to making a lot
Yeah.
of this happen. And you mentioned Launch Darkly, and there was another one that you said
Split IO.
Split IO. So what's the
Yep.
difference between those two? That's actually not one that I've heard of before.
Yeah.
Why would you use one over the other?
Um, so I've used Split IO a lot in a lot of the startups that I was at because it had a free tier that enabled us to do quite a bit, right? And um, Launch Darkly, frankly, didn't. I think their model, Launch Darkly is not cheap. I'll be honest. Their model, I think, if you wanted, like, from what I understand, if you're a startup, you can probably talk to them and they'll give you some access to their APIs. But they're not something I can just go to the website and click and sign up for free. So that was a lot of why I went with Split over Launch Darkly. There are other options out there. Um, Launch Darkly has a lot of feature capabilities that kind of extend beyond some of the simpler stuff. Example is they've got something that, and honestly, I'm just trying to wire this up to see how good it works, but they've got something that's supposed to hook into your like GitHub repo and tell you that this feature flag is still in your code, but it's not being used anymore, right? Or maybe you've removed it from your code and you still have it in your system, right? So it allows you to kind of do some code cleanup to realize this feature flag you've got turned on permanently. Like everyone's always on. You basically deprecated the feature flag, but it's still in your code. There's an opportunity to go clean up some code, right? So things like that are just kind of like extra add-ons, and their use is easier to kind of get people to understand how to use it. So that was kind of a big thing too. I'm like, I don't want my people having to spend a lot of time learning how to use the tool.
Yeah. I think app config,
App
AWS app
config is where it
config
is. Yeah. Yeah.
does something like that.
Yep.
Back in the day when I was trying Launch Darkly for the first time, I was put off from using it in Lambda and serverless environments
Yep.
because it's the SDK or the client isn't really like an API request response kind of
Right.
thing. It's a pull a manifest down and evaluate
Yep.
the query against the manifest.
Yep.
And when I tried it, granted this was years ago, it was a long time ago at this point. It was not fast. I think it was adding at least a second to all my cold starts. How's the performance now?
So you asked me about this the other day, and I was going to look to see what the actual raw numbers were. It's a lot faster, I will tell you that. But there's a couple things that I'll keep to keep in mind there. One, today for me right now, we're using it mostly asynchronously, and obviously that doesn't work for some of the things that I talked about today, right? Where it does need to be in your synchronous path. But there's a couple things that when you use it, it does pull down a manifest, but it's not like trying to figure out like all the possibilities. It's figuring out like what's configured and it's going to calculate, right? So it's not really expensive. I do believe they've done a lot to improve the performance of that. The other thing that I'll say is this is a big thing, and you and I talked a little bit about this the other day, is this is a big kind of like when you're trying to decide between like the lambda model and the per endpoint model. This is a big reason to go the lambda model, because when I initialize that client, it'll survive across cold starts. And if I have an endpoint per function, then I have cold starts across every function. So I have to make this call every time. But if I have one entry point and it goes off and figures out, which the specific code base I need to use, now I can spin this thing up one time and use it across all those different endpoints. So what we do is we have, we're using AppSync, as I mentioned, but every one of our services will have its own kind of, AppSync API or AppSync Lambda function, and it handles all the requests for that particular API. And most of them, I should say. Well, there'll be exceptional cases, but most often that's the way it works. And that allows the cold starts to be hit one time for things like this. There's a little bit of extra overhead, and then subsequent requests don't have that. And you have a lot fewer of them because you're using the same Lambda function repeatedly.
So I don't really want to turn this into a Launch Darkly commercial, but I
Yeah.
have another question for
Yeah.
you. The way that I understand that it works is it pulls down that manifest and initialization, and then it uses server send events from Launch Darkly whenever there's a toggle to a flag.
Yep.
Now, the part that doesn't sit right with me approaching it this way is I know when that Lambda function execution stops, it freezes that runtime environment.
Yep.
Do you know what happens when that gets unfrozen? Is it like queuing all of these server send events and then applying it to what it has in memory?
So I'm not exactly sure there. I do know it does have something in place to spin it back up, right? So it does wake up and realize that it needs to pull for things. I think in that case is what I'm guessing, right? Just kind of based on what I read in the docs. And I was going to ask them this a long time ago, but again, I started not really using it a lot for the synchronous stuff right now, so it wasn't as big of a deal. But I think it's kind of like taking hey, pull, this is the last time I got data, give me everything up to this point in time, and then update. But the reality is, like, your features aren't changing that often, your toggles, right? Like, you're not in there changing like 100 toggles a minute, right? You're in there changing like a toggle here, a toggle there, right? If you have like a massive customer onboarding, maybe you get a whole bunch, but it's not like something where you're constantly having to go through and like, when this Lambda was shut down for an hour, I'm going to get 200 requests. I may only get one, I may get none, right? So I don't think it's like a big amount of data that has to ingest when that happens. It's not like it has to load the whole thing again, but I don't think it has a lot to do either.
It's a really good call out. Didn't think about that before I asked
Yeah.
that question. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Are there any other concepts that you didn't talk about that are low lift? Like, one of the things that I really like to do is make sure that can we give people really easy, actionable first steps to get somewhere.
Yeah.
And probably my favorite pattern that you recommended in here was the segmented queue. So you have different event bridge rules based on the tier that has different throttling inputs, but that if I don't have that and I want to implement that, that's not trivial in a lot of cases because you also have to bake in the tiers into the rules and declare a bunch of things. Is there anything that's easy? I want to put that in air quotes because that's
Yeah.
obviously subjective.
Yeah. So I mean, so if you're going the feature flag route, for example, and you want to do the segmented queues rather than going through Event Bridge and having the tiers through your data, you can have like the feature flag, instead of returning a true false, you could have it return the name of the queue to send it to, right? And so you can say, call this feature flag. Given this tenant, the feature flag system says, I know what tier they are. This is the tier, this is the queue to send them to, and just send it to the right queue, right? So in your code, you're sending directly to SQS. You don't necessarily have to have tier information in your data. You do have to call into a feature flag, and that feature flag says, this is the name of the queue to send it to, and it takes care of it for you. So that's kind of like another way to approach that same problem. Obviously, that the example I gave implies that tier information is in the data that we're passing around. And I would say, if you're thinking about adding tiers, start adding it even if you only have one. If you think you're going to do it later, like, just put tier as a first class citizen of your app. It doesn't need to be used a lot, but just having it in your data allows you to start doing data analysis that includes tier information, right? So put it in your, your JWT, or, somewhere in the information that you can pass through the application, so you always have it, and start putting it places even if you're not really using it today.
And is tier something that is just like a magic string that I'm storing on a user record?
Um, I wouldn't call it a magic string, much like a user ID, right? Or a group or a role, right? Yeah, I guess it's sort of a magic string in that it's part of your data model, right? And this is one where using Lambda authorizers, both in API Gateway and in AppSync, allow you to kind of modify things. Actually, I say that that's not the only place you can do it. If you're using Cognito, you can do a pre-authorization trigger, or a pre-token trigger, I think is what it is. And you can add things to the JWT token, right? And so you can expect that to be there because you're putting it there on every one of your requests. So yeah, sort of magic, but it's like you can actually bake it into the user, right? So if you're using Auth0, right, or Octo, whatever it is today, you can add attributes. If you're using Cognito, you can add custom attributes to the users, and this would just be one of those attributes.
I like that. So I've been commandeering all the questioning. I want to give everybody else here an opportunity to ask you something if they have something before I continue. If anyone has something.
I have a question more on the usage plan, right? And the rate limiting.
Yeah.
That you talked about. I haven't used usage plans that much, but mostly it comes up when, hey, I can add an API key. But then there's a big box that says, don't use this for authentication. So is that just mainly having like an attribute that you know who it is so that you can rate limit them, right? That's basically the only. And still, if you don't pass in that key, it can still act as some part of authentication. But is that the main piece there?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really good point. I think you'll see people quite often use the API keys and API gateway as authentication, and you definitely shouldn't, right? It's more of it's to know who they are and to be able to do things like usage plans. You can use it through your application to kind of like know who they are if you want to. It's not usually what I'll do. I usually will use a bearer token, is kind of the general thing that I'll use. But adding the API key allows you to tie it to a usage plan, and it will stop them from being able to access it if they don't have it in place, right? And that's not so much authorization or authentication. It's more just like it's a bad request, right? Like, I expect this header to be there and you didn't provide it, so you don't get in, or the value that you provided to me was invalid, so you don't get in. I personally don't see that as authorization. They may return a 401 or 403, I don't know, but at the end of the day, it's just a bad request. But what you will see is the ability to now, by having that, be able to start returning, 429s or whatever it is for limiting, rate limiting.
Cool. Yeah, I've definitely been misled, and I have used it once or
Yeah,
twice
very common.
as auth, and then saw that box because it's at the bottom. It's not
Yeah.
of the documents. It's
Yeah,
not
I
at the
feel like they
top
don't
where you
do a good
say,
enough.
"Oh,
Yeah, they don't do a good enough job talking about it. It's like, if you get into it, people will tell you, no, don't do it. But and again, it's on the page, you're right, but it's not like front and center. It's kind of misleading because I think you use API keys a lot in other applications, and they are your authentication, right? And so like that's what's confusing about it. I think it was a bad name for it. I
Yeah.
think it was just like customer identifier or something, something else to say this is not that, right? But because it's not a secret, like quite often you'll put it on a website, right? It'll be like something that's literally, I can go look at your network request and I can see it. And that shouldn't be something that exists for something that's truly authentication.
Yep.
I had implemented a whole thing one time. It was an automated process that generated a usage plan and an API key for a new tenant. And I was super proud of it. And I posted about it on Twitter. And Eric Johnson jumped on that within 2 minutes. And he said, that better not be the only authentication method that you have.
Yeah.
And I was like, I hope nobody else sees this. But a serious question about that. You have the usage plan and the API keys that you had in your presentation, and then a lot of the other pieces that we were talking about were app sync resolvers.
Yeah.
Where's the jump here?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's like I said, like it's a missing thing for AppSync, and I hate that. My application today doesn't really have a big usage problem. Like, and some of it is like, if you think about like how your application is being used, right? If it's user based, right? Like they're in a web page, rate limiting isn't likely to be a huge problem, right? Because a user can only click so fast, right? Unless they're like trying to go out of their way to be, attack you, they're not likely going to hit it at a real high speed. When you're building APIs that are meant to be consumed by computers, right? So like, if you think about like a lot of the APIs that AWS is building, and a lot of, you might have a company that's building an API that's meant to be accessed by some other company's system. Those are computer to computer things. And in that case, the potential for data flying through it really fast is really high. So putting something, I would never do that in GraphQL. Never do that in GraphQL, because at least not with AppSync, because that capability isn't there, right? Now, again, you can throw WAF in front of that, and WAF at least I think can be like, for this IP address, I can do some limiting so it can't get hit too fast. And so that allows you to kind of just do some like protection based stuff. I don't know that you could, but maybe you could with some really advanced rules. I wouldn't really think of it as a way to do it as a per tenant rule, but it can at least be like a protectionist kind of rule where it's like, only allow 100 requests per second, period, ever from this IP address. And WAF you can't put in front of AppSync, by the way.
So for those that are watching that might not know what WAF is, what is that?
Yeah, web application firewall. It's just kind of just a general, like really it's kind of a best practice if you're going to have something client or outwardly facing. It's just to protect you against things like SQL injections and cross-site scripting. And there's a lot of like rules that come out of the box pretty really easy. Definitely turn those on. It's a little expensive, so I don't run it except for in my production environments. But actually I run it in my test and production just to make sure that those two are identical. But my developer environments don't have that turned on because it's just too expensive. But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of a good, measure to give you that like warm, fuzzy feeling that you're not going to be attacked with the most basic things, right? Denial of service attacks and things like that. It's going to give you some basic protection out of the box.
And it has DDoS protection as well, right? And then it gives you like a certain level of support with AWS in case you were in an attack, and it gives you a bit of a financial cushion as well.
Yeah, I think so. There's the basic WAF stuff, and then there's Advanced Shield, I think is what it's called, and they have some overlap, and I honestly don't even remember what that overlap is and where like one makes more sense than the other. I've typically just used WAF. I know Advanced Shield has some extra things, especially in the financial case area, and I think it's got some really strong DDoS stuff. The WAF does give you some basic DDoS stuff, but yeah, there are options there.
I saw Daryl come off mute, so I'm gonna draw him out.
I'm just gonna say that the Advanced Shield is nice, yeah, but it's super expensive.
Yep, really expensive.
Now I say it a lot, and it's because I don't usually have to pay the bills, but security is almost always worth the cost. That's
it is
one of the things that we have to remember when it comes to expensive.
It's like an insurance, right? You pay it, you don't want to use it, but when you have to, it's nice that you have it.
For sure. I
was
think
gonna
it's
say,
always a
like-
balancing act, right?
I was just gonna say, I really think the WAF is a really good idea because it's not super expensive like
Right.
advanced field, and it catches a lot of basic things.
Yep.
Like we had an audit done on our platform, and we had some really stupid mistakes that if we didn't have the WAF in front of them, we would have been exposed. But
Yep.
the WAF caught them all. So
Yep. Yeah, it's worth doing in a production environment. You're right. It's not like super expensive. I think I can't remember what the cost is per month on it. It's based a little bit on throughput, but it's kind of like has a basic cost. And like, so at our place, every one of our developers has their own AWS environment running the full stack. And so like, I try to avoid things like that raise the cost, right? Because it's just like, that makes it to where it's like, I don't want to be paying, $200 a month per developer to run these things. Ours are usually running like in the $20 to $30 range. And that's an acceptable number. But like, if it gets exorbitant, then I have to start justifying it.
Then you have a developer that DDoSes himself, and then
Yeah,
you got a
exactly.
good pricing thing to
Yeah.
deal with.
Okay, so I don't know how we got here. What was the answer to, is there an easy paid tier thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mentioned kind of the going directly to putting things directly into queues instead of using the event bridge rule. But I think really, I don't know there's a super easy way, but I think that the thing that I would draw out there is start doing it early, right? Even if you don't really think you're going to do it, put it in your code early, have it there in your user token from the get-go, because that enables you to start doing things later, even without having to make a bunch of code changes, allows you to start doing it late, pretty early on, right? And then again, like if you want to start doing some feature stuff, you don't want to spend a lot of time and energy on it, use the app config one, right? Like it'll do the basic stuff for you for sure, right? It's not going to be necessarily the most like bells and whistles that you're going to get out of like a launch darkly, but it'll be effective. And start using them, right? If you want to load configuration on a tenant by tenant basis or a tier by tier basis, start doing that from the get-go with a tool like, app configs feature flag or whatever you want to do that early so that as you go through, you get in that habit. And if you create that habit, it makes it a lot easier to just kind of flow that through your application.
Okay. All right. But what if I didn't? So I asked
Yeah.
this is a serious question.
No,
I
absolutely.
asked this in the first session of the SaaS month, and it was, a lot of developers will build something for themselves and they think, you know what, I could turn this into SaaS. I already have it. It's already a thing. And now I'm going to start charging money for it. But then you start getting into it and it's like, holy cow, is it best to just start everything over because I'm missing a lot of these capabilities that you were talking about and what everybody's been talking about this month. So I'm actually really curious to get your opinion. What would you recommend doing in a situation like that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it depends, right? That's always the answer to everything, right? It depends. If you got some if you got some massive thing done, then you don't want to start over. There's no way, right? If you got some small thing, maybe you look at it and kind of the thing. You look at it and determine whether or not it makes sense to replace. And the thing I always say about software engineering is the code itself isn't where the complexity lies, right? I mean, sometimes it is for the wrong reasons, right? But the complexity, the business complexity was figured out in the process of creating that code, right? And so you created the code to cover some complexity that you're trying to solve, some problem you were trying to solve. That's where the value is. The code itself is a representation of the value. So we are often afraid of kind of starting over, but sometimes starting over makes more sense because it's just not that complex to rebuild the code, right? Because you've learned things. That said, sometimes you're too far along and that's too far. That's really difficult to do. And I would imagine you're going to hear the same kind of answer from almost anyone, and that is to use something like the strangler pattern, where you just start pulling things out one by one and start replacing them, right? And when it comes to like adding tiers to your application, it's just like find one feature and do it. And that's the only feature. And you don't have to expose this to everyone right away, right? You're just like, hey, now I've got this one spot in my code that triggers on a feature. Everyone's got the same one. I can test it, right? By turning them on or off, but everyone's getting the same feature. And then I just start adding them. And I go everywhere in my code that I want to do this, and I just start adding it. And once I get to a point where I've got enough, then maybe I start introducing these tiers to people, exposing it and the ability to purchase them. But don't be afraid of making changes that nobody sees.
Woo, put that on a quote block. Dang. I'm going to mark 56 minutes and put a chapter in the YouTube video for this just called gold. And we're just going to jump to the gold. It was awesome. Okay. We are out of time. That flew by. This is, yep, I'm going to say this is probably my favorite presentation this year, including the one that I gave. So
I appreciate that.
Really, really, really good information. There's a lot of information in here that sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but it has to be said out loud to really understand it and realize it. I think your awareness is really, really high. And I am looking forward to this turning into a blog post.
Yeah, I definitely will have to put something together for it.
Please do, especially with those animations that you added. Those really were very powerful in there.
Yeah,
those standard
I'm not sure how
PowerPoint
great they were.
animations, or how did you get those?
I just did them in PowerPoint, honestly.
Okay, well, that's teach me how to do that too.
Yeah, it's a little kludgy. I'll be honest with you. It's not great tool for it, but it got the job done. So
it did. Okay, so do you hang out in the Discord at all, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So if anybody has further questions, you can ping Jason directly in there, or just raise up the questions, and we all like to jump in and help out. Sure. So, but this was the last talk for SaaS month, April SaaS month, and next month it's a long month. We have 5 Thursday sessions, 5 weeks. And we're going to be doing serverless innovation as our theme. And we're going to be focusing on builders and creators who build things that say, I never thought about doing it that way. Ro's on the call right now. He's one of our speakers next month, going to be talking about the platform that you made to teach others about serverless. Super cool. And then we have just a lot of other great speakers next month. We have Jeremy Daly, Alex Debris, Elad Ben Israel, Ron Eisenberg, whole bunch of different people talking about a range of things. So it's a busy month and an exciting month. So yeah, keep looking forward to that. And thank you all for coming out today.
Thanks so much, everybody.
See you guys.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Y'all.
Bye.